today on the Learn It, Use It podcast.
I can't speak to every organization, but I think a lot of it is the shortage has more to do with either the workplace, the organization, not so much pay. Pay is important, but I think there's a lot of things that people are looking for that a lot of organizations are not offering. And so I think that's going to be the key for leaders is as we change, we need to adapt versus staying in our old ways of saying this is how we do it, because the workplace will kind of vote by their feet, meaning they will go to organizations that value what they want in the workplace and value their kind of what I would call their culture and what they find important.
Dr. Morris has been teaching in the Operations Management program since 2011. His academic background is a doctorate in leadership, master's degree in management, and bachelor's degree in business. Dr. Morris has taught leadership and management courses since 2001. He has a professional background in higher education with experience in research, private, and two-year institutions. Dr. Morris has held leadership positions at several colleges and universities. Currently, he is an operations manager for academic partnerships based out of Dallas, Texas. He lives in Bentonville, Arkansas with his wife Christy, son Nate, and dog Sam. Dr. Richard Ham is the Associate Director of the Master of Science in Operations Management at the University of Arkansas. Dr. Ham retired from the United States Air Force and the Department of Homeland Security, where he held various regional and national leadership roles. He is a recognized subject matter in Homeland Security, consulting domestically and internationally for the United States government. Dr. Ham teaches courses in leadership, cybersecurity, global competition, Homeland Security, resilient design, and unmanned aircraft systems. This podcast is by the Operations Management and Engineering Management programs in the College of Engineering at the University of Arkansas. In our programs, we stand by, learn it today, use it tomorrow. The instructors for our courses are professionals with real-world experience where you will be able to immediately apply what you have learned. Today's workforce is changing rapidly and all fields require adapting to new environments, which means you need new credentials quickly to improve your current performance. Our graduate programs and certificates apply to all industries so you can be competitive in today's workforce.
All right, thank you, Karin, for the introduction and giving us an overview. Today is a podcast topic that we hear people always have great interest. More and more interest we always have at U of A and in the two programs that I'm involved with. We have a lot of quantitative and hard skills that we teach, but more and more and more, what we hear from industry and what we hear from students about what they need help in is soft skills. And specifically, I don't know, those of us that have led groups would question whether you would call leadership a soft skill, but it's an interesting thing because we all learn our own journey. So today, we've got Adam Morris with us. He has experienced one of our long-term instructors in the OM program, but also has what we would call this real-world experience, leading people and dealing with those challenges. So, Adam, glad to have you here today.
Thank you.
And looking forward to hear your perspective. Why don't you, if you could, just kind of give us a little bit of background about yourself and you know, some of the things on your journey that kind of got you to this point where you've kind of developed your own leadership style.
You know, something about leadership I've always been fascinated with, and as we talk more, kind of started with athletics and just watching a coach and my baseball coach, and, you know, things he would do is we could not say yeah, we had to say yes and yes, sir. And so it really got me interested in how do you develop and how do you mold people. And so I went into business for my undergrad. And so one of my first jobs was in retail, and I was able to get a management position in retail. And so that really helped me understand that just because you tell somebody something to do something doesn't mean they always do something when you're talking about a management. And so also learning how to interact with people. So for me, I started in retail, worked for that, went into higher education, got several management positions that way. And so learning how to deal with people with advanced degrees, learning how to deal with people in what you would call classified settings. So from hourly to, salary type positions, developing that. And so one of my roles was then at the vice president level. in which I had a large staff and a large group of people reporting to me. And at each level, Rich, I noticed that it's different. It's a lot different than to manage 2 people versus 100 people, and I've done both. And so with that, that's the main reason I did that is I like to invest in people. And so for management, as we'll talk here in a minute, and leadership, is you invest in people, you see their potential, and you meet your goal. And for me, that's kind of how I got developed. So my master's in management, I got a doctorate in higher ed leadership. So for me, leadership's, and by the way, this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. So really looking forward to developing that conversation. So for me, educationally and also career-wise, really wanted to have a management, but more importantly, leadership focus.
So, great, by the way, a great background in how you go from, and the different dynamics when you have a few, when you have a lot, and how you organize. But one of the things, we use this often in the OM and EM programs, we ask students when they brief to do bottom line up front, the bluff. And so, kind of just jumping into it, the bottom line up front. What do you think is the most important characteristic of a leadership? And why do you think that characteristic is so important?
It has to be integrity. And the reason I use that word, I don't use it lightly because they're like, well, that's an easy word. That's, isn't there something you want more in depth? The reason I put integrity at the top is because a leader that does not do what they say they're going to do usually will fail. So if they are not honest, if they're not reputable, they will have a hard time getting their followers. I brought 2 books with me, and one of the books talks about having followers. And not that that's in a, bad type of way, but if you're going to lead people and they're going to follow you, they need to believe in what you're saying. That's the thing. If you ask most people, does it matter if your leader makes mistakes? No, as long as they tell me about it. Do you matter if your leader, takes a direction that you're not happy with? No, as long as I know what they're doing. So I always stick with integrity because, answering your question, what is that one? And so I go back to that integrity. You could also throw in honesty. Kind of those 2 terms are the same. But is a leader going to be able to do what they say? And is it somebody that you can trust and believe in?
So that is, and I think that's a great example of why it's important. One of the things I think, and I kind of go off script a little bit. One of the things is, so you mentioned already, kind of implied about the difference between management and leadership.
Yes.
But you see this. So integrity means honesty, and some of that has some vulnerability in it, admitting your mistakes. And then you go into, you take the HR class, which is very important.
Correct.
And you start getting all these attorney warnings about you should admit that or you shouldn't do. So walk us through a little bit about that and how you walk that line between those two.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Many firms, you've noticed, they're doing layoffs or reduction in force. Is that something you necessarily at the top go, hey, we're going to reduce the workforce by 30%? Eventually, yes, you have to, once those things start happening. But if you're in the discussion phase, if you're in a phase in which you are brainstorming, I think sometimes your leadership at the top does have to limit that information because it's kind of like with my child. I don't necessarily tell him everything all up front, meaning it's not that I'm trying to hide things. There may be things I need to put through a lens. And so I think that's the same thing with leadership. You may have to put things through a lens before you tell your entire staff what it is you're going to do. So, with the HR, yes, there are many guidelines that you have to follow. I think you're transparent, but I also think you have to look through it through a lens.
Yeah, and so I've been there myself, and sometimes, I've even had to talk to employees and say, it's really not appropriate to talk about that now, but, I promise you we're going to do the best we can, and then you build up some credibility with them that they believe that.
Yes.
Over time.
I think that's the thing is you build credibility. And it's also all right to say, I don't have all the facts that I can share with you right now, but they are coming. Right. Just know things are in the works. And most people will be fine with that. Not all, but most.
Right. Well, kind of married to that then is, it seems, and some of it might be a 24-hour news cycle, some of it might be social media, but we see what appears to be a uh, a growing number of just very public leadership failures in industry, in government, in academia. I mean, and you see these things, and they seem like they're bubbling up more and more. Can you talk a little bit? First off, is that just my perception, or if not, then what do you think is causing some of that?
That great question, because I think there's so many factors to that answer. One of the things is we have access to information immediately. And so, dating myself as a kid growing up in the 80s, watching Reagan as president, most of the news seemed favorable in his opinion. You had 30 minutes of news. Most of it was what he was doing. I rarely remember anything poorly being said about him other than Johnny Carson, again, dating myself, maybe making fun of him. So with that access to information, I think a lot of our mistakes become public very quickly. And so I think that's one factor of, just as we're seeing now, we have two presidents that are now being investigated for classified documents. Not saying that wouldn't have been known 50 years ago, but right now it's instant. We know exactly what the news is reporting. I think the other thing is, kind of going back to your question, is, are leaders worse off than they were before? And it's something that's I get asked a lot. And one of the questions on my exams, if you ever take my course, are leaders born or are they made? And there's no right answer, but I do think with leaders, there is a training aspect. So if you were to ask me, I'm going to go more of the made category of, in leadership, there's always training. And it's developing. It's no different than if you were lifting weights, running. It's a skill you continually have to develop, and it's a skill that is something that has to be practiced on a daily basis. And what I mean by that is, are you weak in public speaking? Are you weak with personnel issues? Those are things you've got to work on. So I think with leaders, a lot of times they've got to work on those things that are necessarily a weakness, but also understand that sometimes we need to give our leaders a little bit of break, especially when you're talking the big ones in the government, or like government, politics, athletics. There is a lot of spotlight, and it's very easy to nitpick somebody. And so for me, I think it's a combination of giving leaders a break and also allowing them to be trained in the areas that they're deficient.
Well, and that's a great point, because you see the things right now, if we look at leaders in government especially, but in industry too, it's like an unwritten thing that's been developed that they will never admit that they're wrong, because if they do, it has become basically you've just opened yourself up for attacks and everything else. And so, early on in my career, you just say, I made a mistake on that one, we're going to rethink it. But now if you say it, it seems like it's a totally different world. And so how does that affect leadership in general?
That's one of the things people ask me, how come people don't become leaders or get into these roles? And I said, just to your point, Rich, I said the pressure and the stress of being in a leadership position is difficult. And so I think why some folks don't become better leaders or become leaders is because that stress is enormous. I've seen people in, let's take the corporate world, of like, hey, there's an opportunity to be promoted. No, I am fine right where I'm at. Used to be, you'd see that kind of, progression in your career. I'm hearing more and more of the workforce, nope, I'm fine where I'm at, and then there's difficulty filling those positions because the stress and pressure of being under the microscope.
Right. And you'll always have detractors.
Yes.
I was fortunate in 40 plus years, especially early on in the military. I had some high level, really great leaders that took time to mentor me. And I wouldn't always say that this is correct, but it was a guide that I had from a general officer, and he told me, he said, because I was talking to him about, I was trying to change some things, and change makes people angry. So a lot of people were on the attack, and what he said to me was, he goes, if somebody's not upset with you at some point, you're probably not doing anything. And so he said, you just have to learn how to do that and then deal with them and hope that they're not upset with you over everything. So it was pretty good advice. I took it. I mean, at least it helped me to go, well, it's not just I'm a bad person. I'm trying to make change.
Yeah.
And that's part of the issue.
I think so. I think you're exactly right. Good point. You're always going to have detractors, and you're going to have to, take that voice out. I think where the kind of the pressure and stress comes when it's constant, and sometimes you're caught in the middle of trying to make a decision, and you're trying to make everybody happy, and that's not going to work. And then it hits social media, and especially if you're talking, more public positions, and it becomes a lot more challenging.
Well, and so you kind of answered that, are leaders born or made? But a simple little, I read it in One Flight one time. Somebody said, you really should read this. A book that I think Malcolm Gladwell wrote named Outliers. And it talks about these virtuosos and these people that are and basically the premise at the end was they start out very gifted, and then they practice or work on their skill for 10 to 20,000. If they just took their original skill and just didn't really practice, they'd be mediocre. Or if they didn't have that gift and they did practice, they'd still be mediocre. So it's these two things together. And so how do you develop? I mean, got a course. You teach the course.
Yep.
I've taught it. I think it's a really good course to kind of learn your style. But what's the advice for someone that says, hey, I want to be a leader. I know in the future I am. What kind of things should they do? First
thing I would recommend is get a mentor. And that's get somebody that you look up to, someone that you've watched that has been in that role. I could sometimes use athletics a lot of times with leadership of, just as you said, you can have a great athlete. And we've seen it if you follow athletics, all the talent in the world. Well, he didn't go to practice, or he wasn't taking instruction and, did not make that next level, or did not make his professional goals. Same thing with leadership. Find a mentor, find a coach, find somebody that says, I'm going to kind of walk alongside you. There's all sorts of assessments out there, from personality profiles to strength finders. Find out, what are you good at? What are things that you want to, use as a leader? I've often said, people are like, can an introvert be a leader? Sure. I've got the Lincoln on Leadership book. Lincoln was an introvert, and developed that storytelling, developed his communication style. So working on those strengths. Are you detailed? Are you not detailed? And so you work on those. Does that mean you're going to be an expert in everything? No. But I think why I say start with a mentor is that is somebody that can assist you. The other thing is, put yourself in leadership roles. If you want to be in that, that's where you step up. Is that at church? Is that in the workplace? When somebody says, hey, I need somebody to run this project, you raise your hand. And you want to find things that stretch you. And you know what, Rich? Here's something I always try to tell in class. It's okay to fail. It's okay to fail as long as you learn from your mistakes. Because, as we were mentioning, some of your mistakes can be magnified. But if you're in those entry-level roles, wanting to be a leader, it's okay to say, I could have done this better. Because I think for that shows growth, and that most likely will make you a better overall leader in your organization.
Well, you brought something up that kind of keyed back to me from the course, and one is Lincoln on Leadership, and I'd like to come back to that one later, because that's such a great book. Every student that I've ever had in that class, they without exception, they say that's their favorite book,
right?
For a lot of reasons, and there's so many things that he did. It's like before there was even the formal leadership and management training, where he just either learned it himself and applied it. So anyway, we'll come back to it. But the other book that we use in that course is the Nordhaus book, which is really a compilation of all these different leadership theories. And then some years he drops one and adds another one, and it grows, it contracts, but also expands at different times with new theories. And it's kind of I used to have a joke, it's the theory du jour, right? So a few years ago, servant leadership was the theory du jour. You don't hear it as much now, but I mean, that's what everybody was pointing to. If you asked anybody in an interview, because they went through, what kind of leader? Oh, I'm a servant leader. Everybody said, and you say, do you really know what that means? And so you point to what that means and asking the question. So, I, when you look at those, I personally, and I want to hear your take first. I personally kind of boil these down into one or two because you're not going to memorize all the tenets of 15 different theories, but I kind of break it down into two. How do you, when you look at those, how do you look at that survey of all the theories and then apply them?
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point because I think it is a combination of everything. You mentioned servant leadership, founded by Greenleaf in around 1970. That was kind of the buzzword. Then it went away, and now it came back. And I think you're right. Servant leadership. That means the leader's going to do everything I want, right? And it's, well, no. It's, more about investing in people. A lot of them, the ones I like, they kind of come back to a couple different things. One, people don't care what you know until they know how much you care about them. I kind of messed that up, but that's a lot of times it goes back to that empathy, caring, also, working to develop someone. I always think if you cannot go wrong investing in somebody. So for me, with the leadership styles, I always try to go back to how are you investing in your people? How are you training them? And also, which we don't talk a lot about here recently, it seems like, where's the accountability? And when I use the word accountability, it's not necessarily, gotcha, Rich, you did this wrong. It's more, this is how I can make you better. And so I think with leadership styles, they're all mixed and intertwined. But I think it goes back to the investment, you're dedicated to your people, your accountability, and how are you going to make your goal for the organization? Because bottom line, corporations, they're there to make a profit. And so you've got to use that in order to make your profit.
Well, you said something again that is insightful, I think, to look at these. One is, I'll give you a quote. Now, there was, when I was younger, my wife and I, we would go to a lot of parenting seminars. And one we always liked to go to was Gary Smalley. He had the love languages and all of this. But this quote that he gave, now it's applied to children, but at least, and I want to get your take. I always took it to be the truth for me as a leader. But he had a quote, and he'd say, rules without relationship always lead to rebellion.
That's great.
And so, so you kind of touched on that. Can you expand on that a little bit about what that really means?
Yeah, I think kind of going back to that accountability piece is if I know someone is investing in me, caring for me, they can say, Adam, I want you to work on becoming more detail-oriented. I want you to be a better listener in a meeting. I've noticed you get off track. Adam, we want you to be able to have a better writing style with some of your memos. Again, if I know somebody's investing in me, I think we all have areas that we can improve on. And so, even you were talking about HR earlier, I've done it too. So that's, again, some of my mistakes. When you're doing evaluations, while it's easy to go, Rich, you're a great guy. You do everything right. And I think there needs to be some of that, but there also needs to be, this is what I want you to work on. And so kind of that, if I know somebody's invested in me and cares about me, again, goes back to that high school baseball coach. Adam, I was a pitcher. Adam, if you would just change your form, you would pitch the ball better. He wasn't saying it. It was twofold, right? Get me better, we play better, we win. Same thing. If I get somebody to, in essence, become better in that organization, that could possibly lead to another sale, increase profit, fill in the blank. And so it's kind of a twofold for me. But
yeah, I mean, all that's if you find that the leader's actually looking at you to develop you, what a difference. But so I'm gonna chase a rabbit just for, on Lincoln Lincoln on leadership. My take, but let me come back to this, what you said. So I always boil them into, and I've studied it. I don't know how many times formally, and then kind of lived through it. But I always kind of boiled it down to, are you a transactional or a transform? And not just by those theories, but by the overall, are you a transactional leader or a transformational? In other words, is it all about you do this and I'll pay you? You do this and I'll pay you. Or is my style to transform you? And it seems like people understand the difference between those two really quickly.
Yes, they do.
So what's your take on that? I mean, how do you make sure, because there's always some transactional. things, right?
Correct.
But how do you make sure that's not that people are remembering the transformational part, not the transactional part?
Yeah, and it's hard to get there because a lot of times, and that's where I think it's that training and coaching. You could have a great employee, but they could always be waiting. If you're my supervisor, Rich, I could always be waiting on you to tell me what to do. Very transactional, right? I think when you want to get that person transformational, it's like, I want you to take the next step. So instead of just printing out this report, I want you to review this report. I want you to see, is there any mistakes? Is there anything that you would have added if you were presenting this? And so you try to get that person from just doing exactly what you said and now thinking ahead, being able to say, this is how we can make it better. This is something I've noticed if I was presenting this. So for me, transforming that person is, in essence, helping them reach their full potential, because I've been there. First job was McDonald's. You told me to flip a burger, I flipped a burger. Now, some of the jobs require that. However, I remember I had a boss saying, do you want to do this task now? This would help me out if you learn this. And then I went, well, can I learn this as well? And so for me, transformational is all about developing that person to be better within that organization and then ultimately help the boss. I always tried to, in supervisory positions, and I kind of meant this, I always tried to say, I will hire somebody smarter than me. Everybody would laugh, but there was some truth to that, because I said, if I make them better, they are going to make my job easier. And so I want that individual that can, in essence, bypass me in some cases, because they're going to make my job easier. And if they're only with me for a couple years, I always used to say, I'd rather have a star for 3 years than somebody that was going to bog me down for 10.
Right. Well, that's so true. And it's easy. It's so easy when you're trying to figure out when have you reached that potential. So Lincoln on Leadership, a great example is a quote from him. I'm kind of paraphrasing, but basically he said, never stop looking for your grant.
Yes.
And that led up to a series of things that he had done. So talk us through that a little bit about what did he mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, and that's, again, if you're watching this, one of the test questions. So I'm giving a little preview. I said, why did Lincoln go through so many generals? Kind of finding that grant. And a lot of that was, I had various answers. Well, that was his own fault. He should have fired him sooner. He should have, but I think with Lincoln, what he did with that and finding his grant, one, let's be honest, probably a little bit on him, but he was also trying to figure out what worked best for him and what worked best for the Union Army. And so I think that took him time to figure out until he found his grant. And so I think that's also within leadership. Every person out there is not going to work well with me or work well with you. You know what? That's okay. But sometimes it's finding that groove and finding what styles does work. One of the things I was going to mention here, and we can go in more detail in a little bit, is, the culture of the organization. I may not be a fit with every culture of the organization. You may not be. And it's a matter of, same thing with kind of that, your question about Lincoln. Were all these generals bad before him? I don't know. I haven't studied the history of that as much. It just didn't work for what Lincoln was needing.
Well, and we see the letters that, up to that. He was trying to develop some of those.
Yeah.
And it's like they just weren't taking the hint.
Right.
He was saying, you need to do this, and this is what our goal needs to be. And so it seemed like he was trying to develop them from afar. He didn't have Zoom.
Yeah.
So it's letters, right? And so
Yeah.
there's little interaction, but he's saying, but I'm watching what you're doing, and we need to do this. And then when he did find his grant, he figured out what the right, what the right element was. But as part of that, one of the things he did. Now it actually is part of my style, because of who mentored me and things that we all get from our parents or whatever. So Lincoln kind of used this parable style, I would say.
Yes.
And one of my favorite ones, and everybody can look it up afterwards, is the one that he told about Ethan Allen, which I just find for retired military, it's like the greatest story. But this use of parables and how he used that. Can you talk a little bit about why that's so powerful to people?
People love stories. And so with a parable, it's very easy to, you talked about the North House book, same thing in my class. They love this book, The Lincoln, and then on my feedback, well, we don't like this one.
Right.
And I'll get into that for a second. But the reason that the Lincoln book is they have the ability to kind of connect the storytelling. So why does parables work? People love a good story. And so if I can give you an example, tell you about something that happened, they're going to be able to relate to that, see that imagery. Like I said, with my baseball coach, you could see, okay, he was working with me on the pitching. It's very easy to say, oh, he was working with me on my mechanics, da-da-da-da-da. But they want to hear that story. How did it end? And so that's why I think parables are so effective, is you can kind of see a beginning and an end, because we all love a good story.
Well, and so this kind of comes back to what you were saying before. My experience and leading teams of different sizes over 40 years is that one of the things that I found effective was when I was trying to work with somebody and they're having something I just can't break through, and I share a personal failure, something when I tried this when I was younger. This is what happened. Let me, here's where it heads. I've watched how, the things you try to tell your teenage children, but they don't listen to you, like they got to learn it on their own. But at least sharing some of those and that, that level of transparency and vulnerability sometimes helps build a relationship. So if you use that kind of technique.
Yes, you jog my memory. So in the class, one of my discussion boards is, I say, share a leadership or ethical dilemma that you faced. So the students will get on, make a videotape, upload that. By far, that's the favorite thing in the class, because we've had people share, I've seen someone stealing in the workplace. I've had a boss that didn't treat me correctly, you name it. But what is good about that is they've shared their story, and then the people will comment on, hey, how did that turn out? Or if it did turn out, oh, sorry you went through this. I maybe would have done this. So they'll give feedback on how can they make those changes, or what they could have done differently. So again, it's kind of that sharing that story and making that personal connection. Just like you said, a lot of my management positions, it's been, let me tell you about my failure. And usually you get they kind of perk up and like, oh, you're going to share. And I said, I've been where you've been, or I've made the mistake. This is what I've done. So I think people can relate to something if it's happened to you, or something that you're sharing that's, a personal connection.
Well, and one of the things, so I've been in organizations where the culture was a zero tolerance for a mistake.
Yeah.
Crimes are something different.
Right.
We could talk about, a crime is a different thing, but a mistake. And, it's like I several people, even in industry here, students I have says where I'm working right now, it's a one mistake career.
Yeah.
You make one mistake and you're done. And so this pressure leads them over time to have all the things we're seeing. We see, in our time, it was still, people generally would say, I'm going to go work at a place. I'm going to do that I might be at that same place 20 years, or I might be there 10 years and find a promotion. Now, at the end of a career, you've got some of these younger folks that might have been at 10, 12, 15 organizations in a 40-year work.
Yep.
And so talk a little bit about, for leaders, what you can do in that case.
Yeah, well, you've kind of got a multifaceted question there with great points, because I think you're right. Gone are the days, my father's generation, definitely my grandparents' generation, I'm going to work for that company from 18 to when I retire at whatever that was, 58, 68, whatever. Those days aren't happening as much. And, I'm not saying that was better back then, but there is I think a cultural shift in which you're not going to be in an organization that long. And so I think you're going to see more and more folks kind of changing jobs. more and more often. I forgot the second part of your question there. I blanked there.
So I was asking first about how they don't stay as long, but then what is the actual leadership? What tenets do you use that kind of changes that, or even recognizes, that it's okay to make a mistake? It's not a
that's
one
right.
mistake deal, right?
Yep.
And try to bring them along.
Yeah.
To understand the culture.
Yeah, I think, thank you, got me back on track. Kind of with the mistake deal, that's unfortunate in my mind, because I think you grow by making mistakes, because I think you want to take risk. And what I mean by risk, like you said, you don't want anything illegal or anything like that, but you want to say, I pushed the envelope here, or I really tried to expand this project. Well, you may have made a mistake. Instead of saying, well, you made a mistake, you're gone. How can we learn from that mistake, and how can we develop on it? And I think as leaders, what we want to be very careful of is, I've talked about accountability. There's a difference between accountability and what I would call just kind of that, oppressive thumb on you of like, you need to do everything right. Because here's the reality. You're not going to be perfect. And that's even for leaders. And if we're expecting perfection, that's not going to happen. I think what we need to do is develop a system in which you do double check, you do find mistakes. However, I think you've got to also have people give them the freedom to make mistakes. Doesn't mean you don't hold them accountable, because if I'm in a banking organization, probably I couldn't make too many financial mistakes without something happening to me. But I do think you should be able to allow them to be trained, and I think you need to allow them to be able to say, how can I learn from this mistake? And as a leader, I think we need to do that.
So that kind of segues into a couple of things on how you develop people. So I remember there's a great quote from Richard Branson, and the quote I'll probably butcher it, but I'll get the gist of it. He was going through a process of greatly increasing the training budget, and his CFO said, we're spending all this money, and he said, the CFO, who's just looking at the bottom line on the training money, goes, what if we give them all this training and then they leave? And, think what that will cost us. And Branson's response is, well, think what it's going to cost us if we don't give them that training. So that's kind of the first half of that. But the piece, I think, that I was fortunate enough to have a great mentor, he was very good at this. I mean, just very informal. I didn't even realize that he was mentoring me half the time. I thought we were just having coffee. But one thing he would always ask me, he said, well, since the last time that we've met, how many of your people have been promoted or selected? And he would drive home to me that your goal is to develop not followers, but the next generation of leaders. And so if you're the leader, what's happening with the people that work for you? So can you talk to that a little bit about how you measure that?
I love that question, because I think that's exactly right. Is, like I said earlier, I would rather have had somebody for 3 years, 2 years, whatever that is, than somebody for 10 that's bogging me down or the organization down. I think that's something you can take great pride in, is looking back and say, I took, not necessarily it's all on me. I didn't mean to make it sound like that, but I can say I had somebody in an entry-level position. Now they're a VP in an organization, or they're running their own company. And I think you can take great pride in that, because, as you can tell, for me, it's about investing in that person and seeing what they can do. But the other thing is, I say it a little bit selfish, if I've got them for 2 or 3 years and they've made my job easier, it's a win-win. But I think also I need to invest in them. One of the things I tried to do when I was in leadership positions was, what is the next thing? And it would be, and sometimes I would get, well, what do you mean? Well, what do you want to do? Oh, well, I'd like to get my degree. Okay, how can we work on that? I'd really like to be a manager of, mid-level manager. What are we going to do to work on that? So I think that's the other thing of, when I did that, and again, I'm not the only one that does that, it showed you invest in your people. And then back to your point, I love the Branson quote, is I could say, okay, go figure it out. No, let me help you. Okay, what type of degree are you looking at? Or let's get you into some entry-level management training. So assisting them, because a lot of these things are just not inherent. It's not that you just walk in and go, oh, I figured it all out. Again, mentoring, training, that's always going to be important from my perspective in getting somebody to a level that they want to be.
Well, and I I don't know about your experience, but I've had this experience where, and I understand it because you invest a lot, and a person comes up, and then you spent 3 or 4 years, and you spent money, and then they leave, and then leaders are like they're angry, like it was disloyal that they
Yes.
got promoted. And I remember asking, and I kind of had that when I was young. I remember as a young lieutenant, and this same kind of mentor, I said, I just spent, I spent $10,000 on this and blah blah blah, and over the last 3 or 4 years, and then they took that and they went somewhere else. And he asked me, he goes, "Well, did you want him to get promoted into your job? Where are you going?" So it kind of hit me. I'm like, well, I guess that's probably true. Where was he going to go, and why would I be angry about it? It does me more work now. I got to recruit and spend time looking for
Definitely.
those qualities. But still, I mean, it ought to be a win when we see one get promoted.
Well, here's the other thing: is it is a win, and it's sometimes hard, and including me, to think long term or kind of the big picture. I also have in my mind right now, if you were to say, Adam, put together a team of 10 people, you're starting a brand new company, and you can pay them whatever. I've got 10 people kind of in my Rolodex, dating myself, that I could call. The other thing I've had happen, which has been good, those people have also come back. I've had them come back. I had a different opportunity. I would give them a call. And so I think a lot of times it's, while yes, I get that, sometimes you're like, oh, I just got Rich to where I want him. He's trained. He's 3 years. He's a great employee. Now he's leaving. True, you're going to have to retrain. However, I don't know what's going to happen in a year or 2 years. Rich may come back, or that person. So in my mind, you can't go wrong investing in people, because here's the other thing. It may work the other way. Maybe I go to that person's organization and work for them. And so I think it's about investing in people and networking in that case.
Well, so do you think, I'll chase a rabbit here for a minute again, but do you think I see frustration, I'm sure you and I are very similar. I'm kind of a leadership nerd. So I read a lot of things, read things, everything from, business journals to leadership and I look at those and look, not just in the Chronicle, but also in the industry. And there is this kind of underlying anger of leaders about this phenomena, quiet quitting.
Yes.
And so, give me your thoughts on that, because it seems like every generation thinks the ones after them are doing it wrong.
Right.
Yeah, right. So we all, and you need to understand yourself enough to know that that's what you're going to automatically think. But talk about that quiet quitting and what kind of, how it's interfacing with leaders now.
Yeah, Ken, great question, because I love what you just said, because as far as the generational thing, when I was 18 years old, they were saying my generation didn't have a chance. They are doomed. And so it's sometimes hard to look at somebody at an age and go, oh, they're not going to make it, because age is relative, and also understanding different generations, they all have a different take and they have different experiences. So, the quiet quitting, I had to take time and research this. I was like, what in the world is this, and why is this happening? And so I was seeing a lot of, well, that's on them. How can they do this? I think it also goes back to, while you have to have accountability, you have to have metrics, how you measure performance. Also, you've got to be understanding of, what does work look like in that organization? Give me an example. So if you and I were salespeople, I'm sitting at my desk 8 hours a day. I sell $100 a day. You sit at your desk 2 hours a day, and you sell $1,000 a day. Well, which employee do you want? And so I think it's also understanding, where's the value and importance. I think so. If you're having an issue with performance, address that. What are your metrics? How are you gauging performance? Because I've always said, and we were talking earlier about kind of the remote work and work in an office. I can sit in an office 8 hours a day. That does not mean I'm any more valuable to the organization. Anybody can sit 8 hours and do nothing. And so for me, it goes back to when I hear the quiet quitting is how are you measuring performance, and then how are you getting performance out of your individuals? Because if you're having a performance issue, address it.
So that's a great. There was, and it's kind of fallen out of vogue, but there was actually kind of a tangential theory some years ago called outcome-based leadership,
Yeah.
and it focused on, stop worrying about time, worry about outcomes, and then how do you get somebody to those outcomes? And the remote work is a great example. So we already know the literature was we were already kind of heading this direction, right?
Yes.
And then the pandemic put it on steroids, and now leaders are in a position to say, okay, I want you to come back, and they're like, but I beat all my goals last year.
Yes.
So was it bad during the pandemic that I performed this well at this level, or what is it? And it's a struggle to answer. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I've struggled with the answer myself because I think I'm one of those ones, oh, you can't be as productive at home. I'm just going to watch TV all day. Well, I've kind of shifted to that. From that old school mentality, professionally, I grew up, if you're not in that chair at 7:45, you're late because at 8 o'clock, you should be in full gear, full bore working, and you stay till 5:15, make sure things are wrapped up. And so I kind of grew up in this professional mindset of time was very important, meaning you had to be there and you had to work late. Now I've kind of shifted that focus in which how are you becoming productive, and what are the things that you're doing in order to be. So I use that sales example. I sell $100 a day, you sell $1,000 a day. Well, which do I want? And so, when we talked about, you said the pandemic on steroids, I think organizations have to learn what is that balance. For me, and again, just my opinion, it's a little bit of that hybrid. I think you do have that connection with people when you bring them together. I think that's good, share a meal together. But also, if I'm working on a report on Excel, do I need to be physically in the office or can I be at home? And so what works better? So I think that's the one thing when we were talking about generations. What I've learned, I think, for this what I would call up and coming generation is that flexibility in the workforce is important, and we can be productive if we know our goals.
Yeah, it's a challenging time to figure that out as a leader, because if I think of 40 some years ago when I remember the first team that I was on. That team we worked together, we socialized
Yep.
together, we played.
Yep.
That was like your entire
Yep.
life.
Yes.
And now the paradigm gets shifted because with remote work, it's not. So, talk about a little bit. Why you think that's changing some of the paradigms?
I think the paradigm's shifting a little bit is because you can do everything remotely. Grab your laptop, and for most jobs, not all, but most jobs, you can do the majority of it from that laptop. And so our work has changed. Gone are the days. One of my favorite movies is Cinderella Man, Russell Crowe. And he would go if you've seen the movie, he would have to go to the docks, and the boss would come out and go, you, and you're working today. Well, so that was a different time. How he had to work, he had to show up at the docks. Now, with a laptop and an internet connection, I don't even know what the percentage are. 50% of our jobs can be done that way now. And so I think we've got to learn that's our new way of work. And one of the things is I think leaders have to adapt to that, or gone are the days when I started working 30, 35 years ago, that the technology has changed, the style of work, and what we do for work has changed. So you have to adapt to that.
And I personally, I saw, like during the pandemic when we were first trying to teach, and everybody's wearing a mask, and some students in person when I was lecturing, English not their first language. They're
Right.
struggling to understand me. I'm struggling to understand. And then when we finally had the time where we said, okay, we're all going to go home, and so we did it synchronously by Zoom and got the technology working. It was better.
Yes.
So I wouldn't have necessarily believed it, but it was better. So the technology and infrastructure seems like it's changed everything.
Well, think about this, just let's use a classroom environment from via Zoom. There's so many different tools. So you can be lecturing, we can have a chat session going, somebody can upload a document, somebody can go online and say, hey, this is what I found. So you have so many more tools to make you effective. Now with every tool, you've got to learn how to use it. And so I think that's also key when we're talking about remote work and things like that. It goes back to my training, goes back to have to use those tools appropriately. And so I can't just pop open a laptop and be an engineer, but with my training, then I can. So I think it's just, but what we can't say in leadership or management roles, we can't say it can't be done, because I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. It's like, well, let's look at the pros and cons and see what can be done versus it can't be done.
So do you think that's a key in some of the workforce shortages we're seeing? Now, a lot of that service sector. I mean, you can't work at in fast food remotely,
Sure.
right? And so some of it's there, but it's not just there. It's also in remote work. Is that the issue, the key, and some of it? Or?
I think, again, you're going to hear me use the word culture a lot of times. I think there's also a little bit of a culture shift in which we're not seeing as many people going back to work after the pandemic. You're hearing, you're talking about shortages. Let's shift a little gears to the teacher shortage. And so I'm hearing from my son's school, hey, do you want to teach? It's like, you could be an elementary teacher tomorrow if you want. Mm-hmm. And I started talking to teachers that were retiring early. And I'm like, well, why are you retiring early? And they gave me a laundry list of things that were wrong. And so I think there's also with that, like in education, there needs to be a cultural shift. Not that you can fix everything that's going wrong for that teacher, but if you're seeing a mass exodus, there are things that need to be worked on. I can't speak to every organization, but I think a lot of it is the shortage has more to do with either the workplace, the organization, not so much pay. Pay is important, but I think there's a lot of things that people are looking for that a lot of organizations are not offering.
I think, and I think that it bears out in what we hear in surveys and what we hear employees say. So, believe it or not, we're about at the end of it. It doesn't take long. And so, if you're, kind of a student of leadership like we both are, that it doesn't take long to fill this time up. But I want to ask you one last thing as we close, and that is, if you had a crystal ball and you were looking in the next 5, 10, 20 years, where do you think leadership is going? What are going to be the things that are going to come to the fore, or new things that you think are going to become evident?
It kind of just what we were previously talking about. I think leaders, if I can say it right, are going to have to be adaptable to a changing workforce. I read something, there was a book I really liked in reading. It was called The World is Flat by Thomas Friedman. And he talks about that no longer is distance going to be an issue in the workplace. He says it's going to be more about time. So, which you're already seeing, this book was written 25, 30 years ago. It doesn't matter if I'm in Bentonville, Arkansas, Tokyo, Japan, with an internet connection and a laptop, I can work. And so I think that's something our technology is doubling. I saw a stat said doubling every 18 months. That was 20 years ago. I'm guessing our technology is doubling probably about every 6 months. Anymore, I got a new phone. It's already probably out of date. And so with that, we've got to learn to adapt as leaders to an emerging workforce that is very tech savvy and that is also wanting a very flexible work environment. We're in a building right now. I saw more bicycles than I did almost cars.
Right.
And so with that, I think leaders are going to have to be able to adapt. And that's kind of the key word I want to leave you with, to a changing workforce. And I don't even know what 20 years from now, what the technology is going to look like for our workplace. And so I think that's going to be the key for leaders is as we change, we need to adapt versus staying in our old ways of saying, this is how we do it, because the workplace will kind of vote by their feet, meaning they will go to organizations that value what they want in the workplace and value their kind of what I would call their culture and what they find important.
So you mentioned something really that spurred something, the virtual workplace. This idea, some of it behind Meta and what they're doing, but leading people that are wearing very small goggles, and basically to them it looks like they're sitting in their cube farm or wherever, and they can interact just by speaking to the person next to them, or they can get into a meeting. So, I mean, that is a whole other topic of what the
realm.
technology will do.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Adam, thank you very much for
Thank
your
you.
insights and providing us some of the things that you've learned. I know you enjoy the course, and the students will get a lot out of your course, but also just the insights on what people can use for some soft skills. So with that said, thank you for joining us on this episode of a podcast on leadership, sponsored by the Master of Science in Operations Management, Master of Science in Engineering Management at the University of Arkansas. We hope to hear from you soon.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Before you go, if you enjoyed today's conversations, would you mind leaving us a review on whatever podcast platform that you're listening on? Our goal is education and helping people improve their professional skills and knowledge to advance in their careers, and positive reviews help others learn about our programs. Thanks, and we'll catch you on the next episode.